Chapter 1. The doors to the High Council chamber yielded with a deafening echo. Silence followed. It was an absolute suffocating quiet that stole the breath from 300 assembled elders and warlords. The air pressure in the towering room dropped, turning the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Calla stood at the center of the dais. She wore the ceremonial silver cloak of the Luna, its warmth a familiar comfort against the chill of the marble floor. For 3 years she had stood by his side. For 3 years she had anchored his fractured mind, quietly filtering the madness from his veins. But today, King Bramwell did not walk toward the throne alone. He strode down the center aisle, his imposing frame casting long, dominant shadows. His hand tightly gripped another. Vespera. Calla watched them approach. The scent of wild orchids and impending storm filled the vast space. Her pulse remained perfectly steady. There was no flutter of panic, no sudden rush of tears, just a quiet, expanding void beneath her ribs. Bramwell stopped at the base of the dais. His eyes, usually a tempest of molten amber, were terrifyingly blank. He released Vespera's fingers and stepped up to Calla. He did not hesitate. His hands found the ornate clasp at her collar. With a swift, fluid motion, he unhooked the silver chain. The heavy fabric slipped from Calla's shoulders, pooling onto the cold stone like spilled mercury. Bramwell picked it up. He turned his back on Calla, crossing the short distance to where Vespera stood waiting. He draped the ancestral garment over the other woman's shoulders. Vespera's lips curved into a slow, victorious smirk. The court held its collective breath. Bramwell finally looked back at Calla. His voice was a calm, calculated strike, designed to sever every remaining tie. "You were never my Luna," he stated. The words bounced off the vaulted ceiling, striking the ancient banners. "You were just convenient." A lesser woman would have crumbled. A fragile human would have fallen to her knees, begging for an explanation. Calla simply stared at him. The last tether of hope snapped. It did not break with a violent explosion, but with a silent, definitive severance. The submissive, enduring girl she had forced herself to be vanished. In her place, something ancient and deeply sovereign awoke. The temperature in the colossal hall plummeted. Frost edged along the seams of the marble pillars. "I see," Calla said. Her voice carried no tremor. It was a sound of absolute Arctic indifference. She reached for her left hand. Slowly, deliberately, she slid the royal band from her finger. The gold ring caught the torchlight for a fraction of a second before she let it drop. It hit the stone with a sharp, final clatter. Bramwell's jaw tightened. A flicker of something undefined crossed his stoic features, but he remained silent. Calla turned her back on the king. She walked with measured, unhurried grace toward the central pedestal. Resting upon the iron-bound pillar was the mating stone, an ancient pulsating relic that tethered the soul of the Alpha to his true equal. Vespera laughed softly. "Let her go. She has nothing left to claim." Calla did not stop. She reached the pedestal. She did not draw a blade. She did not shed a single drop of blood. Instead, she pressed her bare palm flat against the smooth surface of the relic. Static flared in her veins. Pure, primordial light flooded her hand, bypassing the physical realm and striking directly at the core of the magic. It was the raw energy of creation, suppressed for far too long. The stone ignited. It burned blindingly white, struggling to contain the overwhelming surge of sovereign power. "Calla!" Bramwell's voice cracked like thunder, sudden alarm bleeding through his composure. It was too late. The relic overloaded. A sound like tearing sky ripped through the chamber. The stone detonated. It did not just break. It vaporized into a cloud of iridescent ash, scattering the ancient magic into the freezing air. The entire fortress jolted. Dust rained from the vaulted ceiling. The foundations groaned under the shifting pressure. Then it hit him. Bramwell froze mid-step. The air left his lungs in a violent rush. A titanic weight slammed into his chest, forcing the Supreme Alpha to his knees. He clutched his sternum, his pupils dilated, swallowing the amber entirely. Inside his mind, the beast, the untamable wolf that had conquered territories and decimated armies, collapsed. It tore at the confines of his soul, unleashing a roar of pure, unrivaled agony. It was the scream of a creature that had just realized its true, irreplaceable other half had been violently ripped away. The warlords and elders recoiled in sheer terror, staring at their invincible king writhing on the shattered marble. The truth hung in the breathless silence, suffocating and undeniable. Wait, was she the true peace all along? And just like that, the bond shattered. The Alpha King thought he had lost his Luna forever. But what he didn't know was that the woman he discarded was never just a Luna to begin with. In Chapter 2, everything changes. The truth, the power, the woman behind the mask. If you're ready to see him regret every single choice he made, make sure you hit subscribe, because this story is only getting darker and far more addictive. Chapter 2. The underground sanctuary thrummed with a low, mechanical pulse. It was a haven built of obsidian and enchanted glass, hidden deep beneath the jagged peaks of the northern spine. Here, there was no submissive Luna. There was only the silver claw. Calla let the remaining illusions of her former life fall away. She draped the thick midnight black cloak over her shoulders. The fabric swallowed the ambient light. She fastened the smooth silver mask over the upper half of her face. The cold metal grounded her, cooling the lingering heat of betrayal. She stepped toward the central console. The glowing runic grid displayed the intricate supply lines, feeding Bramwell's war efforts. It showed the steady flow of elixirs, warding stones, and arcane reinforcements that kept his empire invincible. With a single, decisive motion, she severed the connection. The grid went dark. Let them fall. Above ground, the kingdom began to splinter, not from enemy forces, but from the sudden catastrophic loss of their magical lifeline. Yet, for King Bramwell, the collapse of his military supply lines meant absolutely nothing compared to the brutal war raging inside his own skull. He paced the royal war room like a caged predator. His breathing was harsh and uneven. The imposing Alpha, who had never bowed to any earthly force, was fracturing. His wolf clawed relentlessly at the walls of his consciousness. It rejected sleep. It refused the sustenance of food. Most of all, it violently rejected Vespera. When she had tried to soothe him earlier, stepping into his personal space with honeyed words, the beast had lashed out. An overwhelming wave of magical pressure had erupted from his core, throwing Vespera against the far wall without him ever laying a physical finger on her. The wolf refused her artificial scent. It wanted its true anchor. It demanded Calla. Bramwell's chest hollowed out. A phantom pain seized his lungs every time he inhaled. Static buzzed through his veins, a constant sickening reminder of the severed bond. He needed the legendary alchemist, the Silver Claw, to stabilize his crumbling army. But deeper down, an irrational primal instinct drove him to hunt. He needed to find something to anchor his unraveling mind. He led his most elite guard into the northern mountains. Desperation fueled his staggering speed. They reached the hidden iron-bound doors of the laboratory. just as the sun dipped below the peaks. Bramwell did not wait for his men to disable the protective wards. He struck the barrier himself. The impact echoed through the cavernous tunnels. The reinforced metal buckled and tore, groaning under his raw, dominant strength. He stepped into the sanctum alone. The atmosphere was entirely different here. The scent hit him before his eyes could even adjust to the dim, bioluminescent lighting. Lilacs. Crushed lilacs and winter snow. Bramwell froze. His heart slammed against his ribs, skipping a vital beat. The raging wolf inside him abruptly stopped thrashing. It let out a desperate, echoing whimper. It recognized the air. It knew this breath. "Who goes there?" Bramwell commanded. His voice betrayed a dangerous tremor. The shadows shifted. Suddenly, the entire laboratory flared to life. Runic circles ignited along the floor and ceiling, casting an ethereal, piercing blue glow across the obsidian walls. A mechanical, crystalline voice resonated through the vast chamber, vibrating right down into Bramwell's marrow. "System recognizes sovereign class energy. Intruder protocol initiated." Before Bramwell could react, a colossal cage of enchanted steel plummeted from the high ceiling. It slammed into the floor, trapping the Alpha King perfectly within its unbreakable bars. The magical dampeners flared instantly. The trap stripped away his physical enhancements, suppressing his wolf and rendering him entirely, terrifyingly, vulnerable. From the darkest corner of the room, a figure emerged. She moved with absolute, sovereign grace. Her black cloak whispered against the stone. She stopped just outside the bars, looking down at the captive monarch. Slowly, delicate fingers reached up and unclasped the silver mask. Calla let it drop. It clattered against the obsidian floor. Bramwell's breath hitched. His knees weakened, nearly sending him to the ground. The face of the mythical silver claw, the supreme power he had come to subjugate, was the very woman he had discarded. Her eyes were completely devoid of any past affection. They held the chilling, untouchable judgment of a deity. She tilted her head, looking down at the man who was currently suffocating under the weight of his own terrible mistake. "You came to beg," Calla said softly. Her tone carried the frigid weight of a final verdict, or to die. Chapter 3. Bramwell's mind splintered into a million jagged pieces. The primal roar of his wolf echoed not in the physical chamber, but inside his own skull, tearing at his sanity. He gripped the bars of the enchanted cage, the cold steel burning his palms. The suppression magic pressed down on him, suffocating and absolute. But it was nothing compared to the crushing weight of the truth standing right before him. Calla, not the submissive, quiet Luna who had dutifully filtered his madness, not the convenient political pawn he thought he had tolerated. This was the Silver Claw, the most feared, revered, and elusive alchemist in the Northern Hemisphere, the being whose intellect and power he had spent years trying to locate, desperately hoping to secure her allegiance to his empire. And she had been his mate, his true mate. The realization hit him like a physical blow, a concussive blast that knocked the air from his lungs. The faint scent of lilacs and winter snow, her scent, the scent his wolf had been crying out for, was no longer muted or suppressed. It flooded the sanctuary, raw and intoxicating, mingling with the ozone tang of her sovereign magic. "Calla," he gasped, his voice a ragged whisper that barely carried over the hum of the runic grid. How is this possible?" Calla did not step closer. She stood just beyond his reach, her posture relaxed but commanding. She was a queen, observing a captured beast. "You spent so much time looking outward, Bramwell," she said, her voice smooth, and devoid of the warmth he now realized he craved. Looking for power, looking for control. You never bothered to look at what you already held. You hid this, he accused, his voice gaining a desperate edge as he rattled the bars. You hid your true nature from me. For 3 years, I lived with a lie. A lie? Calla's laugh was short and devoid of humor. It was a sound that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. I gave you my loyalty. I anchored your fractured mind. I bled my own energy to keep your madness at bay while you paraded Vespera through the halls of our home. I was exactly what you needed me to be. Then why? He demanded, the alpha inside him thrashing against the suppression magic, desperate to tear through the steel and claim her. Why pretend to be weak? Why let me? He couldn't finish the sentence. The reality of his actions was too abhorrent to speak aloud. Why let me discard you? Because you were dying, Bramwell, she stated flatly, as if discussing the weather. The madness in your bloodline, the rot that took your father and his father before him. It was consuming you. The only way to filter it, to purify your blood, was to anchor myself to you completely, to suppress my sovereign aura so that my energy could bleed into yours without overwhelming your system. Bramwell stared at her, horror slowly creeping into his veins, turning his blood to ice. She hadn't been weak. She had been voluntarily draining herself, suppressing a godlike power just to keep him sane. And I would have continued, Calla added, her eyes narrowing slightly. I would have stayed in the shadows. I would have endured your arrogance and your neglect until the rot was fully purged. She took a single step forward, the proximity making his heart hammer violently against his ribs. But you chose her. The words were a death sentence. They hung in the glowing blue light of the sanctuary, inescapable and final. Vespera is an illusion, Bramwell rasped, his hands white-knuckled on the bars. My wolf rejected her the moment you severed the stone. It wants you, Calla. I want you. Your wolf wants its anchor, she corrected coldly. And you want the Silver Claw's power. You are an addict experiencing withdrawal, Bramwell. Do not confuse desperation with love. He slumped against the bars, his imposing frame suddenly looking hollow and defeated. He had conquered armies. He had brought rival packs to their knees, but he had never felt so utterly, helplessly subjugated. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice stripped of all royal authority. It was the raw, broken plea of a starving man. Calla tilted her head, observing him with chilling detachment. Nothing, she replied. She turned her back on him, walking toward the central console. The heavy velvet of her cloak swept across the obsidian floor. That is the tragedy of it all, Bramwell, she said over her shoulder, as her fingers danced across the runic interface. I don't want anything from you anymore. You are free to return to your crumbling empire. You are free to return to Vespera. Calla, please. But, she interrupted, her voice slicing through his plea like a silver blade, you will leave this sanctuary empty-handed. The supply lines remain severed. And if you or your armies ever attempt to breach the northern spine again. She turned back to face him, her eyes glowing with terrifying, ethereal light. I will not trap you in a cage. I will erase your kingdom from the map. With a final sharp gesture, she deactivated the suppression field. The enchanted steel cage dissolved into shimmering blue dust, leaving Bramwell kneeling on the floor, free but utterly broken. Leave, the Silver Claw commanded. Bramwell didn't move. His wolf howled in protest, a visceral, agonizing sound that tore at his sanity. He was a king, an alpha, a conqueror. But as he looked up at the woman he had thrown away, he realized the terrifying truth. He was entirely, irreversibly at her mercy. Chapter 4. The shimmering dust of the shattered cage settled over the obsidian floor, yet the stifling pressure in the subterranean sanctuary only magnified. Bramwell remained on his knees. The air grew brittle. Ice crept along the edges of the runic grid, freezing the very atmosphere in the room. Calla did not walk away. She simply watched him, a deity observing a fallen mortal. Then she raised her hand. She did not strike him. She did not utter an incantation. A singular pulse of sovereign silver light erupted from her palm. It carried no physical heat, only the absolute merciless clarity of a winter storm. The illumination flooded the chamber, turning the shadows to blinding white. The light hit Bramwell's chest. It bypassed muscle and bone, striking directly at the core of his fractured soul. A soundless detonation echoed inside his skull. The dark magic, the insidious, creeping shadow charm Vespera had woven into his mind to twist his perceptions and manipulate his affections, ignited. The false devotion evaporated like morning mist under a scorching sun. The artificial scent of wild orchids that had clouded his senses was violently purged, replaced entirely by the overwhelming, intoxicating essence of crushed lilacs and ozone. As the dark veil burned away, the devastating truth rushed in to fill the void. Memories unlocked. The fog lifted. He saw Calla, not as the quiet, submissive Luna he had carelessly discarded, but as the colossal entity she truly was, the moon spirit. The realization crashed into him with the force of a tidal wave. She was an immortal being of pure, celestial energy. To save him from the generational madness rotting his bloodline, she had deliberately chained her boundless grace to a fragile, mortal shell. She had suppressed her immortality, binding her divine essence to his cursed soul. For 3 years he had believed she was merely standing by his side. Now, the unsealed memories showed him the agonizing truth. He saw the nights she had stayed awake while he slept, absorbing the toxic, chaotic energy of his feral wolf into her own body. He felt the phantom echo of the crushing exhaustion she had endured, filtering his poison through her own pure light just to keep him sane. She had sacrificed her divinity to save his life, and in return, he had stripped her of her title in front of the entire High Council and handed her cloak to the very witch who had cast the shadows over his mind. Bramwell's breathing became erratic. His broad chest hollowed out, collapsing inward under the crushing weight of his own catastrophic arrogance. A profound, unbearable grief seized his throat. The Supreme Alpha, the conqueror of the Northern Territories, completely and utterly broke. Calla, he choked out. The sound was broken, a ragged plea from a ruined man. He didn't care about his pride. He didn't care about the crown, the empire, or the alpha command that usually flowed through his veins. Every primal instinct inside him screamed in unified, desperate agony. He was a starving creature who had just realized he had thrown away the only sustenance that could keep him alive. He dragged himself forward across the cold, polished stone. His hands, which had wielded broadswords and commanded legions, were trembling violently. He reached out, his calloused fingers stretching until they barely brushed the edge of her dark velvet cloak. "I didn't know," he gasped, his voice fracturing. Tears, hot and shameful, spilled over his lashes, dropping onto the obsidian floor. The shadows. She twisted my mind. I couldn't see. "Please, Calla, please." He pressed his forehead to the frozen ground at the tips of her boots, fully surrendering his dominance. It was an act of absolute submission, a desperate offering of his soul. "Let me fix this," he begged, his broad shoulders shaking with the force of his sobs. "I will tear the empire down. I will build it anew in your name. Just give me the chance to worship you. Please, my Luna, please." Calla looked down at the broken king at her feet. Her silver eyes remained twin pools of glacial ice. There was no pity in her gaze, no lingering affection. The warmth he was begging for had been extinguished. She raised her right hand. The air hummed with kinetic energy as she summoned a blade forged of pure, condensed starlight. She did not swing it. She did not aim to cut flesh. Instead, she gracefully lowered the tip of the radiant sword toward his reaching hand. The ambient pressure radiating from the celestial steel was overwhelming. The sheer, suffocating force of her sovereign aura pushed against him, an invisible wall of gravity that forced his trembling fingers to uncurl from her cloak. The pressure struck his chest, sweeping him backward. Bramwell offered no resistance as the kinetic force sent him sliding across the smooth stone, pushing him away until he lay sprawled on his back in the cold, dim shadows of the sanctuary. Calla turned slightly, her profile illuminated by the humming runic grid. Her voice was a quiet, devastating finality that shattered the last remaining fragment of his heart. "You lost me the moment you chose her." Chapter 5. Vespera's legacy was not merely a fractured throne. It was a localized apocalypse. When the dark magic that had clouded the king's mind was violently purged, it did not simply vanish. It shattered outward, infecting the northern borders with a necrotic plague. The forests withered. The rivers ran thick with gray sludge. A suffocating canopy of ash blocked out the sun, plunging the kingdom into a premature, unnatural winter. As the moon spirit, Calla was the only entity capable of halting the decay. She needed the deep root of the ironwood tree, a rare botanical anchor found only in the heart of the ashen weald. She went alone, or she intended to. Bramwell followed her. He did not ask for permission. He did not attempt to walk beside her. He positioned himself 10 paces ahead, a silent, towering shield against the hostility of the dead woods. He wore no royal armor, only a dark leather coat and the imposing dominant weight of his physical presence. Whenever the blighted shadows morphed into kinetic threats, Bramwell dismantled them. He moved with brutal, silent efficiency, crushing the anomalies with sweeping strikes and sheer gravitational force. He cleared her path without uttering a single syllable. He was a man walking a pilgrimage of endless guilt. The deeper they ventured into the weald, the more aggressive the unnatural winter became. The temperature plummeted to lethal depths, because Calla was channeling the vast majority of her sovereign energy outward to quarantine the plague. Her mortal shell was left vulnerable. Frost clung to her eyelashes. Her breath materialized in shallow, trembling clouds. By nightfall, a colossal blizzard of dark snow forced them into a glacial cavern. The interior was a cathedral of blue ice. Calla sank to the frozen floor, pulling her cloak tightly around her shoulders. Her lips were pale. A violent shiver racked her spine. Bramwell remained standing near the cavern entrance. He stared out into the howling dark. He was a living forge. The primal energy of the Alpha burned beneath his skin, radiating a profound ambient heat that clashed with the freezing air. His wolf paced frantically inside his mind. It whined. It scratched at his ribs, begging him to cross the cavern, to wrap his towering frame around his mate, to bury his face in her neck and warm her freezing bones. He did not move. Bramwell gripped the stone wall until his knuckles turned white. He felt completely paralyzed by his own self-hatred. How could he touch her? How could hands that had so carelessly discarded a goddess dare to seek her warmth? Now, he believed he was a contagion. He was unworthy of breathing the same air, let alone offering her the comfort of his body. Calla watched his internal war. She saw the rigid line of his broad shoulders. She felt the agonizing restraint locking his muscles in place. The romantic tension in the icy cavern was a tangible, suffocating weight. It pulled at the oxygen in the room. Calla's teeth chattered. Her hands were numb. Bramwell. Her voice was a fragile whisper, but it cracked through the cavern like a whip. He flinched. He turned his head slowly, his amber eyes wide, haunted, and devastatingly hollow. Calla did not issue a command. She simply extended one trembling hand toward him. The alpha shattered. He crossed the ice in 2 colossal strides. He dropped to his knees before her, the impact cracking the frost beneath him. He hesitated for one agonizing second, his large hands hovering inches from her arms, terrified that his touch would somehow soil her. Calla eliminated the distance. She grabbed the lapels of his heavy coat and pulled the imposing king forward. Bramwell collapsed into her space, his arms wrapped around her trembling form in a crushing, desperate embrace. He dragged her flush against his chest, burying her face into the curve of his neck. The contrast was absolute. She was made of glacial ice. He was a furnace of primal fire. A profound, involuntary groan tore from his throat. It was the sound of a starving creature finally tasting sustenance. He pressed his face into her hair, inhaling the intoxicating scent of crushed lilacs and ozone. His heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, thunderous rhythm that perfectly synchronized with her own. Calla closed her eyes. The heat seeping from his skin was overwhelming. Despite the betrayal, despite the pain, the raw, fundamental truth of the wolf remained undeniable. The beast had never stopped loving her. It had merely been trapped behind a wall of dark magic. For a fleeting moment, the universe narrowed down to the rising and falling of their chests. Then, the shadows in the cavern twisted. The temperature dropped from freezing to absolute 0. The air pressure imploded. Vespera materialized at the mouth of the cave. She was no longer wearing the guise of a beautiful courtier. The necrotic plague had consumed her entirely, twisting her ambition into a volatile mass of dark, corrosive energy. Her eyes were empty black voids. "If I cannot have the Empire," Vespera hissed, her voice overlapping with a dozen unnatural echoes, "there will be no empire left to rule." She raised both hands. A titanic sphere of compressed shadow magic formed between her palms. It was not a physical weapon, but a wave of pure, decaying pressure, designed to extinguish the soul. She hurled the lethal void directly at Calla. Calla's sovereign energy was completely depleted from fighting the cold and the kingdom's blight. She could not summon a shield in time. Bramwell moved. He did not shift. He did not brace for combat. He simply became a wall. With blinding speed, the Alpha twisted his towering frame, shielding Calla completely with his own body. He threw his arms around her, pressing her face securely into his chest, entirely exposing his back to the incoming strike. The shadow curse slammed into Bramwell with the force of a falling mountain. There was no blood. There was no gory rupture of flesh. There was only a sickening, soundless impact that echoed in the spiritual realm. The kinetic force of the dark magic shattered his internal defenses, flooding his veins with absolute suffocating darkness. The primal fire inside him was instantly extinguished. Bramwell's body went terrifyingly rigid. A sharp, breathless gasp escaped his lips. His colossal weight suddenly became leaden. He collapsed forward, bringing Calla down to the ice with him. "Bramwell!" Calla scrambled out from under his heavy frame. She caught his shoulders, rolling him onto his back. His skin was turning an ashen gray. The vibrant molten amber of his eyes was fading rapidly, diluting into a cloudy, vacant gold. "No, no, no," Calla whispered, pressing her glowing hands against his chest. She tried to force her sovereign light into his heart, but the shadow curse was a vacuum. It swallowed her magic effortlessly. Bramwell looked up at her. His vision was blurring. His breathing was shallow, a mechanical failure of lungs that could no longer draw air. Yet there was no fear in his fading eyes. There was only profound, overwhelming peace. He slowly lifted a trembling hand. His cold fingers brushed against her cheek, wiping away a stray tear. "A fair trade," he breathed. His voice was a fragile, fading echo. "My ruined life, for yours." "Do not speak," Calla commanded, panic finally breaking through her eternal composure. "You are not permitted to die. Bramwell, look at me." He smiled. It was a genuine, beautiful, utterly broken smile. He looked at the goddess he had failed and the mate he had finally saved. "I am sorry. My Luna," he whispered. His hand slipped from her cheek, falling heavy and lifeless against the ice. His chest stopped moving. His breath ceased entirely. The towering, invincible Alpha King was gone. Silence deafened the glacial cavern. Calla knelt over his lifeless body, her mind blank, her heart screaming in a void of absolute despair. Then a profound impossibility occurred. Right at the exact second his heart stopped beating, a brilliant, blinding light erupted from the space between them. The mating stone, the physical relic Calla had shattered in the High Council chamber, had never truly vanished. It had dissolved into their souls, and now, triggered by the absolute selfless sacrifice of the Alpha, the invisible tether ignited. A radiant golden thread materialized, glowing through Bramwell's lifeless chest and connecting directly to Calla's core. The bond did not sever with his death. It rooted itself deeper. It defied the boundaries of mortality, anchoring the soul of the dead king firmly to the eternal spirit of the goddess. Chapter 6. The golden thread pulsed. It was a brilliant, fragile vein of celestial light anchored in the center of Bramwell's motionless chest, connecting directly to Calla's sternum. It defied the absolute stillness of his body. It defied the void of death. Calla stared at the luminous tether. The crushing grief that had threatened to drown her abruptly halted, replaced by a surge of pure, sovereign authority. She was the moon spirit. She did not ask the universe for permission. The blizzard outside the glacial cavern ceased. It did not slow. It stopped instantly. Snowflakes froze in midair, suspended in a sudden, terrifying distortion of time. The howling wind was silenced. The midday sun was violently swallowed by a colossal, silver eclipse. A moon of impossible proportions dominated the blackened sky, casting an ethereal, blinding glow over the ashen weald. Vespera shrieked, the necrotic magic twisting her form into a volatile mass of shadows flared, desperate to reclaim its dominance. She lunged toward the kneeling goddess, her hands raised to unleash a second wave of decaying pressure. Calla did not stand. She did not summon a blade of starlight. She merely turned her head and looked at the corrupted witch. The sheer, overwhelming weight of a deity enforcing her will struck the cavern. The air warped, atmospheric pressure spiked to a suffocating extreme. Vespera's scream vanished into a sudden, absolute vacuum of sound. There was no battle. There was no bloodshed. Under the crushing gaze of the Creator, Vespera's form simply lost its cohesion. The dark magic fractured, turning brittle and white. Within a single heartbeat, the witch dissolved entirely into a fine, pale mist that was swept away by the frozen, suspended air. She was eradicated from existence, leaving nothing behind but an empty expanse of ice. Calla turned her attention back to the fallen king. She wrapped both hands around the golden tether. It burned with the intensity of a dying star against her palms. But she held on. She closed her eyes and stepped mentally into the abyss, where his spirit lingered. It was a titanic clash of spiritual gravity. She poured the entirety of her unsealed grace down the bond. The scent of crushed lilacs and ozone flooded the cavern, thick and intoxicating, battling the lingering chill of death. Return to me. It was not a request. It was a celestial mandate. She pulled. The physical exertion demanded every ounce of her bound energy. Static electricity arched across the ice, shattering the frozen stalagmites. Calla leaned over him, pressing her glowing forehead against his cold one, channeling her life force directly into the space where his soul belonged. A single thunderous impact echoed through the cavern floor. Bramwell's chest arched violently. Oxygen rushed into his lungs with a sharp, desperate hiss. The ambient temperature of the sanctuary skyrocketed as the primal fire of the Alpha reignited. It burned purer and brighter than it ever had before. The toxic madness that had rotted his bloodline for generations had been completely purged by his sacrifice and her subsequent resurrection. He was entirely, fundamentally whole. His amber eyes snapped open. The cloudy, vacant haze of death was gone. His irises were crystalline, radiant, and fixed entirely on the woman hovering above him. Bramwell gasped, his broad chest heaving as his body remembered how to function. His imposing frame trembled as he pushed himself up from the ice. He was weak, his muscles heavy from the transition back to the mortal realm. But he moved with desperate urgency. He did not stand. He remained on his knees before her. The arrogance of the conqueror had been burned away in the crucible of the void. What remained was absolute, unfiltered devotion. He reached out, his large, calloused hands hovering for a fraction of a second before gently, agonizingly cupping her face. He needed to feel her skin. He needed to know this was not a phantom conjured by a dying brain. Calla leaned into his touch, her silver eyes softening. The frigid mask of the deity melted away, leaving only the woman who had loved him in the shadows for 3 years. "You brought me back," he whispered. His voice was rough, thick with an emotion so profound it bordered on reverence. "You traded your soul for mine," Calla replied quietly, her hands coming up to rest over his. "I merely refused the exchange." A ragged sob tore from Bramwell's throat. He pulled her forward, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled her scent in deep, frantic breaths, his arms wrapping around her waist in a crushing embrace. He held her as if the universe might try to rip her away again, anchoring himself to the steady, reassuring rhythm of her heartbeat. There was no dominant alpha in the cavern anymore. There was only a man stripped of his pride, clinging to the center of his universe. The romantic tension that had suffocated them for days finally broke, giving way to a profound, desperate aftercare. "I am unworthy." He murmured against her collarbone, his tears hot against her skin. "I was blind. I was a fool. I do not deserve the grace you have given me." "You are my mate," Calla stated, her fingers threading through his dark hair, soothing the frantic pacing of the wolf inside him. "The bond recognized you. Even when your mind could not, you shielded me, Bramwell. You gave everything." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. The golden tether that connected them flared, a warm, pulsing rhythm that settled deep in his marrow. The connection was undeniable, complete, and eternal. Slowly, Bramwell reached up to his brow, his fingers hooked under the rim of the heavy iron-wrought crown that symbolized his absolute dominion over the northern territories. It was the weight of his empire, the legacy of his bloodline. Without a second glance, he pulled it from his head and set it on the frosted floor. "I am no longer a king," he swore, his voice resonating with an unbreakable vow. He took her hand, pressing his lips to her palm in an act of total fealty. "I am only yours, to protect, to serve, to worship. My life belongs to the moon." Calla looked at the discarded crown and then at the man kneeling before her. She did not pick up the iron circlet. A true sovereign did not need a piece of metal to validate her reign. She interlaced her fingers with his and pulled him gently to his feet. "Come," she said. Together they walked toward the entrance of the cavern. As they stepped out into the blinding silver light of the eclipse, the world had fundamentally shifted. The blighted, necrotic rot of the ashen weald had retreated, replaced by blooming, luminous frost flowers that thrived under the colossal moon. A pack of rogue wolves, survivors of the dark plague, had gathered at the edge of the clearing. As Calla walked forward, her hand firmly holding Bramwell's, a profound phenomenon occurred. The massive wolves did not bare their teeth. They did not challenge the former alpha. One by one, the beasts lowered their heads and pressed their bellies to the snow. The ancient pines creaked as the wind died down, the branches dipping in silent reverence. Without a throne, without a crown, the entire realm instinctively recognized the shift in power. They bowed not out of fear, but out of absolute natural devotion to the deity walking among them, and to the loyal guardian who walked a half-step behind her. The era of the fractured king was over. The reign of the moon spirit had begun, and so the Alpha King, who once ruled with power, chose to kneel, not out of weakness, but devotion. And the woman he once cast aside rose as something far greater than a Luna, not just his queen, his fate, his salvation, his obsession. If this story pulled you in, if you felt every betrayal, every burn, every moment of redemption, then welcome to her Alpha story. This is where powerful women rise, and even kings learn to beg. Subscribe now, because your next obsession is already waiting. And tell me in the comments, would you have forgiven him